I think, Rabbi, it's yours. I think
Okay, very good.
I missed something. I think I'm
Yeah.
finished.
So we're on Tes Vav Omid Aleph. Tes Vav Omid Aleph. About a quarter of way down, um, towards the end of the line, V'sover Shmuel. So again, this is a sugya that continues on with the principal point here that we've been discussing. And today I want to spend a little bit more time on it, but the question of ribis, as to whether or not, if you sell the situation was where an individual sold a field, he stole the field, in other words, he stole title, let's just say, and he sold the field to an unsuspecting purchaser. Now, that purchaser, in good faith, went ahead and started tilling the land and fertilizing and doing all kinds of things to the land. And then, lo and behold, the nigzal, the person from whom the land was stolen, meaning that how do you steal land? He says, wait a minute, he forged my signature on a deed. Today, we understand it more clearly because you have people online robbing title, right? I mean, this is a big cyber crime these days.
Excuse me, Rabbi. Michael Horowitz just came on. I know he has some before Shlema, so if I can interrupt a minute.
Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
You're muted, Michael.
Sorry, everyone. Sarah Bas Esther,
Sorry, Bas Esther,
Marissa Bas Tobi,
Marissa Bas Tobi,
Meir Ben Liba,
Meir Ben Liba,
Rachmil Moshe Ben Rachel.
Yerachmiel Moshe Ben Rachel. For
Thank you,
Shalema.
Jay. Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So today we know one of the biggest crimes today is that people either online forge or steal someone's title to land. That seems to be what I'm hearing is a very big crime. And so how do you prevent it? So when you steal title, now the nigzal, the aggrieved party comes and says, wait a minute, I didn't sell this land. It's stolen. So again, in our Gemara, the discussion is he comes and he seeks return of his land. Now, who has the land? The purchaser. So he takes the land back from the purchaser. So the Gemara goes through back and forth, whether it's nechasim mishubadim, whether at the time that he sold him the land, he pledged the gazlan, whether he pledged his own property or didn't. But putting that aside for a moment, the underlying principle is that the nigzal has a right to recover his own land. Let's just say it's nechasim mishubadim. Again, for our purposes, we're trying to illustrate a point. So he goes ahead and he takes back his property. Now, in the meantime, the purchaser improved the property. If he improved the property, he spent money. The property is worth more than when the nigzal, the owner of the property, lost title. So who profits here? Is this just I mean, is it a windfall to him? How do we adjudicate it? What we had said in the last couple of weeks, the way we interpret it is that when a person steals property, he can't convey legitimate title, even though the transaction happened, everything happened, but it's not legitimate. So the Gemara says, if it's not legitimate, then what happened here? So the Rashi helps us understand. We interpreted that even though he didn't get legitimate, the buyer didn't get legitimate title to the property, it's as if he made a loan, a halva, to the gazlan. He made him a loan, and now the gazlan, when he's caught, has to repay the loan. Okay, so in simple terms, he lent him $10,000. He gave him the property. Let's just say it was a down payment or mashkin. Turns out that mashkin is inappropriate because it was stolen. So now he owes him $10,000, and he's going to pay him $10,000. But wait a minute. If you collect $10,000 and then you collect for the improvements to the land, that's considered ribis. That's considered profit. And ribis is also in a Torah. And we'll discuss in more detail ribis itself. But that's the scenario. So how do we get around that? How do we get around the fact that when he collects for the improvements to the land, then and again, to emphasize the words that our friend David certainly pointed to, it's mechze keribis. It looks like ribis. Why? Because he's getting back more than he gave up. He gave up $10,000. He's getting back 10,500 because of the improvement to the land. Mechze keribis. How do we get around?
Yeah,
That's
Rabbi,
what our Gemara has been grappling with in the last few weeks in many different scenarios.
Rabbi,
Okay.
excuse me.
Yeah.
I still have trouble with that. It just seems like the one who gets the extra improvements, he didn't ask for that. He had nothing to do with that. It's like a free gift that came back. Why would it be thrown into the ribis when in fact he had nothing to do with it? It wasn't that he set up to get ribis of any type. He has no choice. The stuff was improved. He's got to take it back the way it is.
Right. So you're right in that question, Jay. But remember what we're saying here. What we're saying here, and again, once we talk a little bit today about ribis itself, it'll become a little bit more clear. But that's why it's mechze keribis. That's why it looks like ribis. To the outside observer, you're watching this and you see the fellow, and you're watching it in court or wherever you're seeing it, and you say, wait a minute, you're scratching your head and saying, what just happened here? I'm a neutral observer. I'm watching this case, and I see where the Bezdin says, you know what? The purchaser, you just loaned the Goslin $10,000 because you didn't get title to a piece of stolen land, right? And Rashi's saying it's a milveh, it's a halvo. You just loaned him $10,000. And this is the observer now. And the observer sees that the Bezdin says, you know what? You must return $10,500. And he's saying, wait a minute, why is the Bezdin allowing the purchaser to receive more than the money that he lent him? Because we're considering it a halvo. And the Bezdin says, this is a halvo. We can't consider it a purchase because he was a Goslin, and you can't transfer owner to something you don't have. So he lent him $10,000. Now, in observation, we see that he repaid him $10,500. So the observer is going to say, what's going on here? This is ribis. I was taught by my Rebbe that you can't lend somebody $10,000 and get back $10,500. You can't do that. So notwithstanding your point, in the observation of the transaction, we see what appears to be ribis. Yeah, you're right, the underlying conditions, but we're not at the underlying conditions. We're just looking at the plain transaction. And the plain transaction looks like a ribis transaction, which the Torah doesn't allow. That's the problem.
What would make the neutral observer think this was a loan, other than Rashi?
No, because Bezdin is enunciating. Bezdin is saying in this case, okay, Bezdin is adjudicating the case and saying, Reuven, you sold a piece of land to Shimon. This is now in the Bezdin. Reuven saying you sold the land to Shimon. It turns out that Levi is here in this Bezdin and he's saying you stole my land. Oh, you stole his land. Ah, okay. So now in its decision, the Bezdin is enunciating and saying, okay, we've wiped out this transaction. This transaction could not have happened because it was a theft of property. Okay, Bezdin is saying it. It's a theft of property. So therefore, we're going to view Shimon's purchase from Reuven as he paid him he gave him a loan on land. Bezdin's going to say that because it's against the halacha to sell stolen property. You can't do it. There's no title. So Bezdin's now enunciating all of this. And to the observer who sees it, this transaction doesn't make sense. Because notwithstanding that it was stolen, he's saying, if you, Bezdin, are saying that Shimon loaned $10,000 to Reuven, and I'm now seeing that Reuven has to pay back $10,500, that appears to be ribis. Why is that allowed? Why, Bezdin, are you violating ribis by saying that Reuven has to return $10,500? So we've laid the whole case bare. And when you lay the case bare, and Rashi emphasized to us when he says, why is this transaction valid? Well, because he loaned him money. It's okay. We're allowing this case because he loaned him money. So if it's a halva, then let's Now we've got to go by the principles of halva in the Torah. Torah says, when you make a loan, you can't take neshech v'tarbis. We'll see what that means in a minute. If you can't take neshech v'tarbis and you pay him back more money than he loaned you, what's going on? So again, we're laying this case totally bare, and so we have to understand all the principles of the case. So that's the case. That is the case. Now, let's take a look at the Gemara. The Gemara says, "The Sover Shmuel lokeach megazin lesle shvacha." So Rav Nachman said in the name of Shmuel, does Shmuel actually hold that somebody who buys a piece of land from a gazan lesle shvacha, that he cannot receive the improvements to the land because it appears to be ribis? That's what Shmuel says. Frank the Gemara of Shmuel Rav Chinana bar Shilas. Shmuel said Rav Chinana bar Shilas. What did he say? Amlich. Rav Chinana bar Shilas was a cipher, says Rashi. Chinana bar Shilas cipher hoyer. He was a cipher. What does he say? He says Amlich. What does Amlich mean? Says Rashi. Yishata kosef shtar hamelech. You write shtaros. So when someone comes to you with a transaction and says, I want you to write the king shtar, meaning the legal shtar, but mocher, im yikabel alav lahagbos lokeach mishefen nechosov karna v'shivko pri im yitrefenu menen. So this is what happens. He goes to the cipher and says, cipher, I want you to write a shtar mechira, and the sofer asks the seller, and he says, are you going to include in the shtar payment for improvements, payments for if the field produces fruit? Are you going to pay if you have to pay if something happens and the land is taken away? Are you going to pay from mediocre properties? Are you going to pay from better properties? This is part of the transaction. Shmuel says to the sofer, this is what you have to ask. In order to get a correct shtar, you have to ask the seller, what are you pledging? What are you pledging? Right? Because of shofra, shivcha, upri. So therefore, he records. He says, I'm giving it from the better property, not from the mediocre property. I'm going to give improvements. I'm going to give for the right produce. So that's the transaction. Now, if Shmuel says this, now, what is the case about? What is the case talking about? Iba balchov, if the situation was where Shmuel said to Rav Chinna bar Shilas, you know what? There's a creditor. You have to write all this in the shtar so that if there's a creditor who comes and collects, he has to know what to collect. So we're positing the scenario here where there's a creditor, not a gazlan, a creditor who will be the one collecting. Frag the Gemara, if it iba bal choiv, mayisle peri. Why did Shmuel ask Rav Chinna bar Shilas for the seller to ask the borrower? Are you the seller, the sofer asking the seller, are you going to give, if the land is taken away by a creditor, are you going to pay payra? Payra means it's not shvach. Shvach means you put fertilizer on the ground, you improve the ground. Payra means there was fruit that grew, you tended it, and the fruit grew. You had a tree and an orange tree or whatever it was, olives, and it grew. Frag the Gemara, that can't be. Shmuel says, Balchov govez shvach, that the Balchov can collect the improvements, and we interpret shvach in avul peiros lo, that a creditor may not collect peiros, only shvach. The difference being that shvach is improvements that are attached to the land. Peiros, if they're fully grown, are not considered part of the land. They're considered a separate entity. You have a ripe fruit, you have ripe oranges. That's not part of the land. So Shmuel wanted to make a very specific distinction, and he said, you know what? A balchov may not collect fruit, but he may collect shvach.
That seems a little arbitrary, kind of. In other words, you would be well advised to try and collect before the fruit ripens completely, because then it's part of the land. Wait an extra 4 weeks, you're out of luck because the orange is already ready to fall down.
In fact, Chaim, as a very specific fact, the answer is yes. That fruit, when it reaches a level of maturity, is no longer part of the ground. So you're right. If he happens to have found the gazlan, if we're talking about a balchov, so if the balchov came and he said, "Wait a minute, you owe me money, I want to collect," you're right. If the circumstance is that the fruit is not even ripe or it's just starting to sprout, that's
then
not
he could
fruit.
have substantial windfall, but 6 weeks later, when the fruit is completely ripe, he's out of luck in terms of that.
Right, but you're right. So it's a question of timing because look at it this way: when it was just coming out of the bud, when in the first produce, you don't know if it's going to become ripened and not spoil or not be destroyed by the elements. You don't know that. You're buying what you're buying in real time. So if you're buying in real time, it's either fruit or it's not fruit. So if it's just schwach with a little bud, fine, that you can take. But when you're coming to collect and it happens to be peiris, you're not allowed to collect it. So if Shmuel says you're not allowed to collect peiris, how can Shmuel say to the sofer, in a case of balchov, make sure you ask the seller if he's going to insure you for the fruit? How can he insure you for the fruit? The fruit is never yours. That's the kasha that we're asking. So if you say the scenario is balchov, that we're talking about a balchov, that's a mistake. You can't have fruit, right? Elolav. So we can't be talking about a balchov, says the Gemara, but lokeach migazlan. It has to be where he took it from a gazlan. A gazlan, there's no prohibition of taking fruit. You're allowed to take fruit. So if we're talking about lokeach migazlan, now we're back to our original question. If he's going to take the fruit or the shevach from the fruit, then it looks like ribbis. You see, if it's a balchov, we don't have ribbis because with a balchov, he's just collecting. He's collecting what is owed to him. Okay, if it happens to have fruit, it has fruit. If it doesn't have fruit, it doesn't have fruit. Because it was never a monetary transaction. Remember, neutral observer. What's he seeing? He's seeing a case of a person giving money and getting back more money. In the case of a balchov, there was no money. The money happened a long time ago, well before this incident. He loaned him money. He's only coming to collect his property or what would be his return. Now he's getting a piece of land that has fruit on it. No one says that's ribbis. No one even looks at it as ribbis. So the Gemara asks an interesting question. If it's a balchov, you can't. That's not our situation because you can't collect fruit. The only person in the situation where you can collect fruit is a gazlan. But then a gazlan has a ribbis problem. So now we're back to the kasha of ribbis. That's the complication here the Gemara is giving us. So let's take a look at Rashi. So Rashi told us, okay, so imlach, so we know what imlach is. So therefore, Rabbi Yosef wants to give us an answer. You know what we're talking about? Sheyesh lo karka. The gazlan owns other land. So when the nigzal comes to collect, he's not coming. In other words, the nigzal takes it away from the purchaser. The purchaser now comes to the gazlan and says, "Give me back my money." Says, "I don't have any money. Here's a piece of land," and he takes the land, and the land may have improvements on it. That's okay because it doesn't appear to be ribbis, because there's no money. Remember, here we're looking at the monetary aspect. If he gives him a piece of karka, he gives him a piece of karka. So what? It doesn't even appear to be ribbis. Ribbis is in the situation where the fellow is in court and watching the transaction and sees that there was money being transacted. If he sees a piece of land, he doesn't impute that that's ribbis. Says Rashi, karka legazlin. He gives him karka and not money. It does not look like ribbis. If it doesn't look like ribbis, it's not ribbis. Okay? It's appearances that count. We're talking about appearances. It appears to be ribis. Okay, so we got the Gemara gives you a good answer.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
why don't they just consider that instead of rivets or whatever, question it, why don't they just consider it as a punishment? He defaulted. That's, his problem for trying to default the man if he didn't have the money to pay him for the property, or whatever he did and whatever he has left on the land goes to the owner.
That's a very good question. And I believe that what we're talking about here is there may be a separate trial or a separate judgment on theft. In other words, the theft part of it, you're right. There's kafel. There could be other punishments. You may have to pay him twice the value, but that's a punishment issue that is separate from the trial of returning the land. So your point is well taken. Yes, there may be punishments, and those punishments will be meted out by the Bezdin, but that's not part, right? In other words, there may be, in trials, sometimes we have two parts to the trial. We have the trial itself, in other words, where there's a judgment issued, and then we have what's considered the penalty phase of a trial. That's what we do to modern law. We have a penalty phase. But wait a minute. Here, the guy is sitting in the courtroom and he sees the adjudication of the case, not the penalty. The penalty phase, like you're saying, there could be kafel involved. There could be having to pay extra money, double, whatever it happens to be that the court will mete out. But in the case in chief, what's the underlying reimbursement? That's a separate matter. And for that, we have this issue of ribas. To your point, you see what I'm saying? You're not confusing the two. You're talking about reimbursement, and then you're talking about punishment. Punishment,
but
you're talking about, is a separate phase. It's kafel. You have to pay kafel. You have to pay double the value because you stole the land. If that's what the Bezdin will mete out. But in the underlying case, and the observer is saying, let me understand the underlying case. There's no penalty yet. There's no punishment. It's strictly what is the Bezdin saying has to happen in this particular case. So the court observer, the observer is going to see that there is there's a restitution of money that seems to be ribis. He has a knowledge of the halacha, and he says, wait a minute, this is ribis. He's getting ribis here. He's getting interest on his loan, because we're treating it as a loan because of the fact that he was a ganef. It could not have been karka. So the Gemara wants to answer. Rabbi Yosef says, you know what? He didn't give him money. There's no monetary transaction which appears to be ribis. He's giving him karka. The value of the land is the value of the land. I mean, in other words, that is not what appears to be ribis. The appearance of ribis isn't the same when he gets karka as if he gets money. That's how the Gemara is justifying that difference.
But you've already call him a ganef. That means he's a crook in the first place.
Correct.
So you're not. Why do you have to try him on his intentions when that you take it since he's a ganef? His intention is he's going to steal whatever he can.
Right, but I think what you're getting at is, so why do we care that it's ribis? Because it's a gazlan. The teretz is that the halacha of ribis applies to a gazlan just as it does to a very fine, upstanding individual.
Oh.
In other words,
Okay.
It's not competing halachas where you say, oh, he's a gazlan, let's waive the laws of ribis. He's a bad guy, let him pay ribis. No, we don't do that. He will be punished separately, and the Bezdin will issue a ruling on how his punishment is meted out, what he has to do monetarily. But as far as ribis goes, we can't cut corners and say, because he's a gazlan, there's no ribis issue. We don't do that. David?
Okay.
But don't we run into problems elsewhere where only a commodity or an article was involved, and the issue of ribis comes up because the value increased between the time of the loan and the time of the payback?
That's the very next thing we're going to talk about in the Gemara. You're absolutely right. That's another issue, and that's what I want to do. We're going to get to it in a couple of minutes, and I want to spend some time then on that subject. Right, you're absolutely correct. So let's hold that a minute. So Rabbi Yosef gives an answer, karka. Now, Frek Amalei Abaya asks, "V'chi muter lelove sol b'sol b'mokim sheish lo karka?" Is it permitted to lend a saw. A saw is a measure of, let's say, wheat. A saw, is it permitted to lend a measure of wheat to get back a measure of wheat even when there is karka? What's the kasha? The kasha is what David just asked, and that is, if I'm going to lend you a saw, a measure of wheat, and it's worth $50, and then you're going to give me back a measure of saw, the same measure of saw, 2 weeks later, and the commodity market rose, and it's now worth $60, isn't that ribis? Even with karka, even if he gives him land, that's ribis. So how can you justify saying that karka is the answer? Oh, it's not money, it's karka. But saw besaw is considered ribis, and that's land, that's not money. He's giving him back not money, but a similar measure of wheat. And yet the price rose, and we consider that ribis. Okay, so that's the kasha of the Gemara. So now, in order to really understand the kasha and the whole concept, let's break it down. Okay, so let me read to you the pasuk in the Torah, in Parshas Vayikra, where the Torah tells us, it's parak. If you're looking, parak Chaf Hey, pasuk Lamed Vav. The Torah says, this is the previous pasuk says, in other words, if your brother loses everything and he's poor, and you have to give him and you have to help him, al tikach meito neshech v'tarbis. You can't take neshech and tarbis v'yaresa melakecha. You can't take. So there's two words, neshech v'tarbis. So Rashi says neshech v'tarbis, that and it quotes the Gemara in Bava Metzia, daf samach amid beis. Okay, so what is the pasuk telling us? That you cannot loan with interest because it's neshech and tarbis. What does neshech and tarbis mean? When we quote, we keep using the word ribis, right? That's what we use. That's the vernacular we say. Oh, you can't collect ribis. But really, there's two things in the halacha here. One is called neshech, one is called tarbis. So, Mitzvah Shem, down the road, we're going to get to Perek Hey and Bava Metzia, and the title of that Perek is Eza Neshech. What is considered Neshech? That's the title of the whole Perek. That Perek in detail will talk about Neshech and Tarbis. So let me read you from the Mishnah. The first Mishnah in that Perek asks the kasha, Eza Neshech ve'eza Tarbis. What's Neshech and what's Tarbis? Now, let's understand, first of all, the meaning of Neshech. Neshech literally means a bite. You take a bite. In other words, what it's trying to say is you take a bite out of someone. If you're forcing someone to pay you more than he got from you, you're taking a bite out of him. That's the word neshech. Tarbis means something different. Tarbis doesn't go to the victim, it goes to the person collecting and say, Tarbis, you have increased yourself from ribui. So they go hand in hand. Neshech, you take a bite out of someone, and tarbis, and you get the benefit of it because you're increasing your value by taking from him. So there's two separate sides of the same coin, neshech and tarbis. Zuk the Mishnah Eza neshech. What's the classic case of neshech? Now let's listen to this. Mal v'sela b'chamisha dinorim. If someone, well, basically, if someone lends someone else a sela, and a sela happens to be 4 dinorim, and when he collects 5 dinorim. So in other words, he has gotten 1 dinar more than he loaned him. That's a classic case of neshech, Why neshech? Because neshech is an iser de oraisa. Minat Torah, you are not allowed to collect ribbis. What's ribbis? I lend you $4 and you give me back $5. Clear as day. That's ribbis. Then the Gemara, the Mishnah says, Ve'eza tarbis. What's tarbis? What does it mean? You're flipping the coin and you're saying tarbis refers to the lender that he's increasing his wealth. How is he increasing his wealth? So the Mishnah says, and that's our situation here. And by the way, tarbis is midrabanon. It's not midoraisa. So midoraisa, what you have is I lent you 4 and you gave me back 5. Absolute clear. That's neshech. Tarbis, says the Rav, says the Bartanura and the Mefarshim, is midrabanon. Ribus ho asura midivrei sofrim. It's ribis, what we call interest, midivrei sofrim. What's that case? Okay, that case is what we just said now, what David was asking. I lent you a saw. I lent you a measure of wheat, a saw, and you're giving me back a saw. I'm not getting more than I gave you, right? There's no ribbis here. What's the ribbis? The problem is that the saw on the stock market was worth $50 a bushel, and when you're repaying me, it's $60 a bushel. So what happened? I just gave you the equivalent of $10 more for the same bushel that you loaned me 2 weeks ago. That's considered tarbis. It's not midoraisa. It's not a direct repayment of more money. You're repaying me the same thing, but its value has increased. So we see a difference.
Rabbi, how
Yeah.
about the other side of the coin?
Yeah.
I'm going to borrow a saw from somebody and the price goes down. And now the person I borrowed it from wants the value that he gave me to begin with.
No, but
So-
he got his saw. How could he complain? He got his saw. See,
Right. So it's the other side of that coin, right? Because he's going to say that I lost out because the value went down and now you need to make up that value.
that he can't collect because he got his saw back.
Right.
See,
So-
the
right.
problem here is not the commodity. You got what you bargained for. You were nice enough to lend me a saw, and I'm giving you back a saw. Okay? So on the surface, nothing happened. There's no, so there can't be an Issa D'Oraisa. There can't be a violation of the Torah because you got back what you bargained for. You got
Right.
back what you bargained for. The problem is that inherently the saw is worth more. And if the saw is worth more, then that appears to be ribbis. Not midoraisa, not Torah ribbis, where I borrowed 4 and I'm paying you back 5, but inherent ribbis because the value increased. Now, I'm on the sidelines watching this, and I'm not a stock market guy. I know nothing from the stock market. I just saw a perfectly innocent transaction. My friend Reuben lent Shimon, he was a nice guy and lent him a saw, and he didn't take advantage of him because the Torah says that if your brother becomes poor, don't take advantage of him. What do? You lent him a saw. Now, Shimon, being a good guy, says as soon as I can gather up my wits and I can improve my lot, I'm going to repay you the saw. And he saw Shimon repaying him the saw. Perfect situation of 2 guys doing what the Torah says you have to do. Help him. The Yoresa Milakecha, says the Torah. You should, in other words, the Yoresa Milakecha, you should fear God and you should know that everything comes from God. Therefore, you have no right to capitalize on the difficulties of your fellow man. You have to help him. You have to help him. He helped him and he got back what he bargained for. And he says, I'm happy. Now, we don't worry about, so the only concern we have is everything went well, except that the value increased. And then we have this annoying thing called ribbis. And ribbis is something you're not allowed to collect. Now, by the way, and again, I may have mentioned this in passing, and in fact, the Gemara did discuss it, and we talked about it briefly, is that you have to be very careful because if you acknowledge something that is more than what you got, you're potentially getting ribbis, i.e., if you thank somebody and you give him gratitude for the loan, then the return of the gratitude, let's say I lend you, you're a very famous man. I mean, you're you know, in the community, you're a big Talmid Chacham, you're everything. And you happen to be down on your luck, and privately, okay, I gave you a loan, and you're repaying me the loan, and then in repaying me the loan, you say, thank you so much for this loan. The chayra, that's ribis, because the gratitude has value coming from you. You are an important person in the community. If you acknowledge gratitude for me, I have just gained a tremendous benefit because I'm being acknowledged by a famous person.
In other words, even if it's totally intangible, if it means something to you, you got to
Correct.
think about something.
Correct. That's right. You have to be scrupulously careful that you are not capitalizing on what you have done to help somebody else. That's how far. Now, la halacha, that may not be punishable. That may not be ribis, but you understand what we're talking about. We're talking about simply a return of someone's of what they got. Now, if that's the case, then the saw, which is a very innocent transaction, turns out to be ribis. And the Mishnah tells us, yes, midrabanan, that's ribis. It's not doraisa ribis, but it's the rabbanan ribis. So the chayra, you can ask, what should I have done in that situation? Maybe what I should have done is I should have given back less than a saw. I should have given 4/5 of a saw, because now he's gotten his value, right? He's gotten his value. Now, Scott, to your question, what about if he loses on the transaction because he lost money? So the halacha does not compensate you for being a good guy and lending someone something and getting it back. Halacha doesn't do that. Give you another example. I lend you a kli, a vessel, and I say, you know what? Hold on to that vessel as long as you'd like. Hold on to it as long as you like. Now, in the meantime, that vessel became a rare commodity. Okay. Now that vessel could be worth double what I got. Or I lend you a vase, and unfortunately your kid came along and knocked off the vase off the table and it broke. So you want to give him a replacement vase. Well, that vase happened to be an heirloom, and it was worth, you look at the vase, you say, oh, this is worth $10. No, it was worth $100. So you come back, so there's a whole shaila on what, but again, we're talking about a completely, there's no ribis, there's nothing else involved. If there's a depreciation, then there's questions about what kind of compensation, but it's not a ribis question. You understand? Another, it has nothing to do with the halacha of ribis. So
what is the distinction between neshech and tarbis on the deraisa level? They're both in the pasuk you read to us.
Because neshech is the clear view of getting more than you bargained for. In other words, midoraisa, like the av malacha, right? What's the av malacha? The av malacha, the neshech, is in plain view. I lent you $4, and I got back $5. Less man the palik. No one is going to say that isn't ribis. It's as clear as day. That's neshech. That is literally taking a bite out of the borrower because you're eating away at his nechasim. You're eating away at his possessions because he now has to give you 5 over 4. When I lend you a saw and you give me back a saw, that's a perfectly fine thing. You gave me a saw, a bushel. I used it. I was fortunate to be able to recover, and I have a bushel, and I say, I don't even thank you. I go over to your house and here's the bushel. So on the surface, what's happened here? Nothing. He didn't take a bite out of anybody. Certainly the borrower is no worse off, right? Who's worse off? The lender, right? Because the borrower is not worse off. The lender has recouped a windfall. He has what we call ribis is tarbis. He has increased his wealth. That's what we call ribis. It's tarbis. It's increasing. There's no neshech. There's no bite out of the borrower. There's only a profit to the lender. and profit to the lenders, say the Chachamim isn't what the Torah meant, but we're going to prohibit it. Because there shouldn't be a situation where the lender gets a windfall from the borrower, even if the borrower doesn't lose. Go ahead.
All right, so here's the problem though. Let's say I'm a farmer, and let's say, we just read about the famine in Egypt and Israel and all this. So at the beginning of the harvest, my buddy comes in and says, my stuff's, my crop late, it's not quite ready yet. Can I borrow? I'm really hungry right now. Can I borrow a bushel of grain? And you say, sure. Return to me, pay it back to me, whatever you want to call it, in 2 weeks when your harvest is done. Finally gets to bringing it back, and the guy, and Reuben says, oh, wow, this is wonderful because I just went through all my stuff. I didn't have as much harvest as I thought. I really need this bushel. This is my food for tomorrow. I need to actually eat this bushel of grain. So if he turns around and only gives me 80% of a bushel because, well, there's a famine, the price has increased, and so now it's worth more, and so therefore he can't give me back the full bushel because now it's worth $1.25 instead of $1. Now I'm not going to have enough grain to eat where I would, and I'll feel bad that I went and lent him grain when I had extra grain, and now I actually need the grain, and I don't have enough grain, even though he paid me back.
But you do have enough grain because he gave you back the same bushel. The fact
No, but you're saying he can't because it's a midrabanan ribis.
Right. So therefore, the Torah says you return. Therefore, you're 100% right. The Chachamim say that you have to return the saw, and we're only going to say that it's ribis, not min haTorah, because in other words, the Chachamim aren't saying pay him less. The Chacham are not saying paying him less. You pay him back what he lent you, but know that inherently you're collecting ribis. No one sees it, no one knows it, because you're getting your saw back, but inherently it's ribis midrabanan. The rabbis were more stringent than the Torah and said that Torah, you're 100% doing the right thing. Don't worry. But because there is something slightly untoward here, say the Chachamim, we're going to penalize you, and we're going to call it ribis. But
even the Rabbanon, either it is or it isn't. If it is ribis, then I should turn around and say, oh my goodness, the price has gone up, I can only take 80%. And if it isn't, but if I take the whole thing and I don't, raise that caveat and hand some of it back, now I'm guilty of a rabbanon, which we
It's
take
muddying
seriously.
everything, and we need some clarity here. We do.
Right. So it's you're positing a very interesting question, because under this circumstance, if he were doing the right thing, then he should not pay him back the saw. He should pay him back less than a saw. Right.
If I'm going to turn around this grain and put it in my warehouse and eventually sell it or whatever, then it's perfectly fine to me to say, okay, you know what, dollar-wise, I came out okay, and so I didn't have much grain, but in the end, it's kind of all the same. Even though, admittedly, if it just sat in my warehouse all the time and never lent it, would have appreciated. But okay, that's rabbanon ribis, and I live with it. But if I actually want to eat it and I'm depending on this food, it's a problem.
Well, you make a good point. But let's go back to the case midoraisa. Let's say I lent you 4 dinner, and you give me back 5 dinner. That 4 dinner that I lent you, let's say for 6 months, if I had that 4 dinner in my possession, I would have been able to make an investment with that 4 dinner, which would have doubled my money in that period of time. Can I have a taina to you that I lost money because I loaned it to you, therefore you should repay me more money? I can't have that taina to you. You're right.
Right, which is the whole heteriska, isn't that?
Which is my mitzvah can't be at your risk. That's what the Torah is saying. That at the time that your brother needed it, you loaned it to him. And yes, you could have made more money not loaning it to him, but you did the mitzvah, and therefore you can't take compensation and take 5 dinner or 6 dinner, whatever the interest would be. Okay, so now in your situation where I lend you a saw and you come back and give me a saw, but now the saw raised in price. So the Chachamim is saying, you know what? That's not ribis midaraisa, because the lender was, the borrower was not hurt. There was no neshech. He wasn't hurt. There was only a profit, a windfall to the other fellow. You're saying, wait a minute, what kind of windfall was there here? What kind of windfall was there here? Because the saw, even though it's worth more money, go ahead, even though it's worth more money.
Right. If I want it as food, it's exactly what it was.
Right. So okay. So where is the problem? If he gave him the saw, and so you're saying that if he gave him back the saw and it's worth more, so midrabanan, we're saying that it is interest because of the increased value of the commodity, right? Okay. So,
Excuse me. When somebody lends the money or lends the saw, they know what they're doing. They know that it can go up, it can go down. There's no, you shouldn't have any kindness against the person because he knew what he was going into by doing the favor.
yeah, but the Torah requires him to help his friend. In other words, it's eleemosynary. There's no profit motive here. He's strictly trying to help his friend in real time. He has no idea what the market will be in 6 months, whether it'll go up, whether it'll go down. He's strictly trying to help his friend. His friend doesn't have what to eat. He gives them the saw, right?
He's doing a mitzvah. He doesn't expect to lose money on the mitzvah.
Right.
He's doing a mitzvah, and therefore, whatever happens at the end of the time period,
Right.
there really shouldn't be kindness to any side of
No. But Menashe's kasha is that since midrabanan, it's considered interest. If he pays him back that saw, now worth more money, he did nothing wrong. He simply is repaying the saw. Why should he be penalized with a isur d'Rabbanan for just returning the saw? So, and again, I'm not going to presume to go through the whole Gemara in Ezer Neshech as to what the outcome is. But if the logical outcome would be, well, in order for it not to be ribis, I've got to repay him less than a saw. So Menashe's kasha is, wait a minute, if you're going to repay me 4/5 of the saw, and I actually need this for my sustenance, I now have less sustenance because of the increased value, so I have been hurt. That's the kasha, right, Menashe?
Yes, correct.
So that's the kasha. So the kasha is, in order to get around ribis d'Rabbanan, what do you do? Okay, so let's hold the kasha. It's a good kasha. It's a good kasha. How do you avoid ribis d'Rabbanan in that situation where it's not just trading the commodity, it's something that he actually needs, and now he's being penalized because in order for there not to be ribis, you're requiring him to pay less than the saw. All right. So
Why doesn't the mitzvah override any implications up?
Again, we're going to have to look at that Gemara more closely. I mean, I'm raising it so we understand our Gemara, but you're right. There are implications of that Gemara that we have to look into to understand what you're just saying, Jay. Does the mitzvah counterbalance the loss here? How to deal with it? Because l'chayra on the surface. Now, let me throw in, David. You have a kasha, but let me throw in one more thing here. If I lent you a saw, and you said to me, I have the saw to repay you, but it's in my grain house, and I don't have the key. This is the Gemara talks about it, the Mishnah. I have to wait for my son to come back from his trip, and he'll have the key. He'll open the grain house, and I'll give you the saw back. Says the halacha, that's not even ribis d'Rabbanan. Think about that. If I lent you the saw, and you're going to repay me the saw from future crop, okay, he doesn't have it. he has to farm his land. He may have had a bad winter. He'll have to wait a season. Ribis d'Rabbanan. If he says to him, I have the saw, but I can't get to it. So please wait until I get the key to my storehouse and I'll give you back the saw. Not ribis d'Rabbanan. It's not even ribis, not midrabanan. Okay, again, it's a fascinating discussion, which the Gemara there is going to talk about. But think about that when he's just getting it for the purpose of a stopgap to be able to repay him because he has it in his possession, and then let's say it went up in value. Let's say, okay, the stock market rose that day, and the next day his son came and not ribis, not ribis midrabanan. The why we'll have to answer later. I'm giving you the example of what the Mishnah there said. So according to that Mishnah,
why are you putting a monetary?
Sorry?
I said, why are you putting a monetary value on it? If I'm borrowing a bushel of grain and I'm returning you a bushel of grain, I'm not using it to invest that bushel. So I'm using it or whatever it is, and I'm returning it. So if it goes up, but you're still getting back your bushel of grain.
Which is why the rabbis tell us that's not what the Torah meant when it said ribis. We are going to impose a chumrah. We're going to impose a stricter. The rabbis can do that. Like they can't be makel. They can't water down the Torah, but they can say, you know what? The Torah says this. We are going to impose a stricter standard, and of course, the rabbinical courts at the time, even today, if our leaders impose a chumrah, then l'chayra we should follow that chumrah because the leadership of Klal Yisrael says to follow the chumrah. Whether people do or don't is a separate matter. But the chachamim of the time kind of have that license to say that in our time we have to treat this a little bit differently. We can't water down what the Torah says, but we can increase the thing. So let's just
very quick thing, which is just from a very practical standpoint today, because we're not going around borrowing bushels of grain, but from a very practical standpoint, I've taken on myself that it is generally because it happens, and neighbor comes to the door, can I borrow a cup of sugar or an egg or whatever? And I tell them, no, you can have this cup of sugar because I don't want you to try to figure out to pay me back, and then either you aren't, if you're not, and I'll explain all this, you're not paying me back, and then you've stolen from me, or if you pay me back and it's not the same amount, then we have these problems and so on. So it's interesting.
That by the way is how the Meforshim understand the Yoresa Belokecha, that you should fear your God and you should never hold back. And in fact, if you're to be benevolent, you don't collect from him. So your point is exactly how the Meforshim interpret the rest of that pasuk, the Yoresa Belokecha. Let me give you an interesting example where how this pasuk has been used. Through the decades, we know that our brethren in Eretz Yisrael have had to deal with many, many hardships, from physical hardships of the land to existential hardships from their enemies. So the Chazal have said, this is literally the halacha. I remember from years ago with Moshe and others, they have said that the pasuk of Neshech and Tarbis, the Yoresa Belokecha, means that your brother is destitute and you have an achrayus to help him. And so therefore you have to give him, you have to lend him, okay? Menashe, you're going with Nimishur Sadin, you're giving. You have to lend him, you have to help him. There'll come a time perhaps where he'll be able to repay you, and he will repay you dollar for dollar. But for Yoresa Belokecha, on a larger scale, not just as a yachid, but as a klal, you have to help him. So they invoke this principle of the Yoresa Belokecha by ribis to say that Klal Yisrael has an achrayus to help their brethren. Doesn't have to be in Eretz Yisrael. It could be in Ethiopia, it could be in Russia, wherever it happened to be. The point of the matter is that the halacha is scrupulous, but we're intoning to you that you should be l'fnim Mishur Sadin and do what Menashe just said. Here's the money, I don't need it back. Here's the bushel, here's the sugar, I don't need it back.
But in a business transaction, when you have an obligation to give something back at a certain time, right?
Right.
You can't say, well, you're not going to believe it. I don't have the key with me. It's in a warehouse down the street. If you're an options trader, tomorrow the market could be different, and the grain that was worth so much today is worth so much less tomorrow. He needed to sell it today. Even then, grain had value to
Right.
a farmer.
Rabbi, isn't what you just said the same appeal that they had for Israel bonds, right? All along, they needed the money, and everybody bought bonds to lend them, but a lot of people didn't go cash them in. They just let them sit there, whatever it is. That allowed us to fulfill that notion of your brother isn't destitute. You lend him the money, and you're not really asking him for it back, even though there may be 20 years later or whatever.
Right. So that's a very interesting shaila, and I don't know the intricacies of it, but if you were a Yerushalayim and you bought bonds, right, and the bonds increased, right. First of all, I think maybe in some cases they actually write a heter iska. They actually write what is considered to be the legal document which creates not interest. Remember, you can collect a fee for your money if you establish in advance that there is a fee for the money. There's a way to get around interest. Okay, so if you're scrupulous and you do that, you're right. So who's repaying the bond? Right, the state of Israel. That's a Jewish institution, right? So on the surface of it, you're right. It's ribbis. It's ribbis.
Yeah.
So how do you get around it? So so la halacha. Again, I think there are many people who say I've got to have an heter iska here because I don't want to collect ribbis, or I treat it differently so that it's not. It's a fee that is paid in advance for the cost of the money. So I'm not collecting ribbis, but we treat it differently. But you're right. In these business transactions, the Chazal never wanted to chill business transactions. We see this from our Gemara, that constantly we see that the lokeach, the buyer, the proper owner of a piece of property is allowed to not lose his money if something happens. We don't want to chill people from transacting business, lending, and et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, we create these conditions where a person can be protected. It just so happens that ribbis gets in the way, so you have to get around ribbis. You have to get around ribbis. It wasn't meant that ribbis should be a prevention from people doing normal business. But there may be times when business will happen and it will border on ribbis. Then your judgment is it a business transaction, or does ribbis prohibit me from doing something? And again, heter iska is a very, very old principle. So it was created to prevent the very thing that we're concerned about, that people will say, oh, wait a minute, if I lend him money and I lose money on the transaction, what's going to happen? So the teretz is, you write a heter iska so you don't lose money on the transaction. So again, without going into the intricacies to Menashe's question, what happens in that circumstance where the person needs the food, and if he's going to collect the saw, it's going to be ribbis. The teretz is okay. So then maybe that tomorrow when we get to it, we'll understand in greater detail that what the commentaries or what the Amoraim say on that particular point. But again, how nuanced it is that even in our Gemara, which we'll just try to complete here for a second, where so here's the punchline that we'll leave you with. So he answered back. Rabbi Yosef answered back to Abaya, Hosam halva, hachazavine. There is a difference between a purchase and a loan. When someone makes a loan to someone else and the whole transaction is a loan, then we consider the monetary return interest if it's more than face value. What is our Gemara's case? Now, our Gemara by a Goslin is that the Goslin sold him a piece of land. It just so happens that it was stolen, and stolen land, as a practical matter, can't be sold. So what do? We impute a loan. Oh, wait a minute, he didn't buy it. He lent him the money. Says Rabbi Yosef, there's a difference between a straight loan and a transaction, which is a sale, which later on looks like a loan. And that's to the original question that David asked a week or two ago about, is it really ribis? That's why the Gemara uses the language mechzei ribis. It looks like ribis. Why? Because of the loan factor. But it didn't start off as a loan. It started off as a sale. It's only because the sale has conditions which don't allow the sale to be completed, i.e., it's stolen property, that we interpret it as a loan. Says Rabbi Yosef, no. That's not a loan. It's a loan in retrospect, but not in prospect. So I'm saying as follows, says Rabbi Yosef, when you have a loan, you can't take ribis. No question about it. When you have a sale that turns into a loan, to me, that's not a loan where the Torah prohibits ribis. So that's how he answers the kasha by saying two different circumstances. You borrow a saw, you're borrowing. You sold a piece of land, you're selling. The two aren't the same. So that's how he answers the kasha. But again, to the underlying question that Menashe asked, I think we're going to have to hold on that and think about that, because what happens, why are you penalizing him? And you say, even if ribis to Rabbanan is no small matter, it's still ribis. I mean, the Rabbanan say it's ribis, but it's ribis. So he was really put out here because he needs that saw. He needs the saw more than he needs the money. And it's going to turn out that the monetary aspect is going to require, if he's scrupulous, to take less product, and he needs the product. So now, not only has he not gotten back what he lent, but he's getting back less, which hurts him more. So that's a different kasha.
Menashe's original lender is now your needy brother. And now he's
your needy brother, correct.
Now he's entitled to an interest.
Now he's in dire need. Exactly right. That's an interesting point. It's an interesting twist on it. But yeah, and Hanami. So let's think about that and see how that plays itself out. But for our purposes in our Gemara, we've now reached what seems to be a satisfying conclusion between Abaye and Rabbi Yosef, that it's not a kasha, because we're now making a difference between what is a straight loan and what is a sale, which becomes improper and turns into a loan, but it's not really a loan. And that, we're saying that the Chachamim were not makbid, they were not makbid, and therefore it's not considered ribis. But this is very important concept, but also what we learned today is the very important chilik between neshech and marbis, because we call ribis. We use the word, we throw it around. It's ribis. But to understand it, the Torah interpretation of neshech, which is the loss, and tarbis, which is the gain, the loss is what the Torah says is impermissible. The gain, the Torah never said was impermissible. The Chachamim said that's what we have to create a siyag. We have to create a fence around, because it's not quite the same. So it's fascinating when you get into the halacha what the chilik is. But for our purposes as Torah Jews, we try to avoid every aspect, whether it's rabbinic or Torah. So we just don't want to get into the whole issue of ribis. So we have to be, therefore, if you're in business, not the sugar egg scenario that Menashe posed, but if you're in business, and by the way, I do this. I mean, if I'm involved in business and there's money being lent, we write a heter iska. We attach the heter iska to the loan document, and it's done all the time. And today, I would say that since frum Jews are very much involved in transactions, non-Jewish bankers in transactions they understand what a heter iska is. They know that there is a document that Orthodox Jews will have to sign and attach to the loan, because normally the loan is sacrosanct, the documents are sacrosanct. In a transaction, especially where it's millions of dollars, they don't like to see extraneous paper because that makes them nervous, but they understand that a transaction of this type between Orthodox Jews only, I mean, not between a Yid and a Goy, but even a non-Orthodox Jew, you are not allowed to do ribbis with a non-Orthodox. You can't. A Jew is a Jew, so you have to, you as the person who is the scrupulous one. The other guy may not be from. He doesn't care what ribbis, what Orthodox. I don't care. But you, as the Orthodox Jew, have that achrayus. You're the one who has to make sure the heta iska, and we do that. We attach a heta iska to documents where that issue becomes a concern. So it's a fascinating subject, and we've just touched on it, but Mitzvah Shem, so we'll pick up on our Gemara next week to continue this whole discussion, because the Gemara does go further on the whole discussion of how we treat, the potential ribbis issue. And the ribbis issue is what's been driving this Gemara for the last few blocks, is we've been talking about Shmuel and the concern about ribbis. That's the whole concern that drives this whole Gemara.
Ashkach.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Excellent
Thank you,
discussion.
Rabbi.
Yeah, shkayach.